work has often been eclipsed by his reputation as a madman.
Vincent and I can absolutely not live side by side without trouble.
There's simply no changing the fact that he's eccentric. It is an incredible story.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In the previous episode, I took you through the Van Gogh legend, which was basically set up by this movie called Lust for Life. I think the title itself also says a lot. I think those words, Lust for Life, speak very ironically about the Van Gogh legacy. Did he have a lust for life, or was he suicidal? Did he have a lust for life, or was he so depressed that he cut off his ear? Did he have a lust for life, or did he sort of go crazy in an asylum? Which one is it? Was Van Gogh someone who really loved life and saw the energy and vitality in the world around him? Or was he a miserable, troubled artist? Which one is it? Now, it's not for nothing that I've included the face of Vincent van Gogh in the opening collage of the whole True Crime Rocket Science, that sort of opening credit. If you see the faces that are flashing there, one of them is Vincent van Gogh. His face isn't there for nothing. When I wrote The Murder of Vincent van Gogh a couple of years ago, the intention of that book was to interrogate three aspects. And to be honest, while I was writing the book, I had a couple of hunches, I had a couple of threads I wanted to pull on from the sort of True Crime Rocket Science school of learning. And to be honest, I thought I might be able to prove my case in one area and maybe somewhat in another area, but I thought it was going to be a stretch to make a credible case in all three areas. And the three areas I wanted to test, I wanted to basically take to trial, were basically the suicide of Vincent van Gogh. Was it a suicide? The cutting of the ear, did he cut his ear himself? And obviously, if he committed suicide, you would imagine he also cut off his ear and vice versa. And then the third aspect, did he have some kind of mental illness? And so, in a weird way, all three of these are connected to one another. If you believe he had mental illness, then you think he would have cut off his ear. If he cut off his ear, he would have probably committed suicide. And the suicide and the mental illness go hand in hand. The mental illness and the suicide go hand in hand, right? Conversely, when you start to disprove, when you go down that path of attempting to disprove, you can kind of have a weird inversion of reality. You can kind of turn the tables, upset the apple cart, where could you show the opposite? Could you show that he didn't cut off his own ear, but somebody else did? He didn't really have mental illness, and he didn't commit suicide. He was murdered. And the popular mainstream narrative is currently that he did cut off his own ear, he did commit suicide, and he did have mental illness. And what I'm going to be sort of showing you is a gradual process that I followed when I wrote The Murder of Vincent van Gogh. I'm not going to repeat the journey that I took so much in the Murder of Vincent van Gogh. I'm going to take you on a new journey, which will be another book called The Last Journey of Vincent van Gogh, or Final Journey of Vincent van Gogh. And through this final journey, we're going to look at Vincent van Gogh in a brand new way. We're going to look at the paintings he painted in the last months of his life. We're going to look at the letters he wrote. We're going to get to know him as a person. We're going to get to know the people around him and the dynamics involved. In this episode, I want to talk a little bit more about the popular mythology around Van Gogh's ear. And then I'm going to provide the True Crime Rocket Science version of that story. And then from there, we're going to look very briefly at Paul Gauguin, the French artist that lived with Vincent van Gogh when the ear incident happened. If you're interested in this kind of analysis, if you're interested in true crime, hit that subscribe button, like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So in the Lust for Life depiction of the cutting off of the ear, we see Kirk Douglas basically feeling so lonely and so devastated that his friend seems to be about to abandon him that he cuts off his ear. So he cuts off his ear because of loneliness. That's kind of the reason. And if you think about the broader aspect that was kind of going on, Vincent van Gogh didn't want Paul Gauguin to leave. He didn't want his friend to sort of return to Paris or whatever it was. And so you kind of have the scenario where he cuts off his ear almost as if to say, this is how much I want you not to leave. He cuts off his ear almost to show him, this is how much you mean to me, or something like that. Now, you might think that that makes sense, but there's another alternative to that scenario, which is that the two argued, the one guy cut the other guy's ear off and then left. That's the other argument. And if you take something that a Colorado Bureau of Investigation agent said regarding the Chris Watts case, if the one version is more horrible, that version must be true. And I guess one can say Vincent van Gogh cutting his ear off is more horrible than any other version, so it must be true. And that also goes into why this is such a persistent myth surrounding the artist, because people seem to like the idea that he's a troubled artist. People seem to like the idea that he went through so much pain and suffering to try and sell his art. And I can tell you now, his art wouldn't be worth as much if people didn't believe that. So it's also in the interest of the museum and the people that have his artwork to sort of promote this myth of the struggling, troubled artist. If you think about the whole history of art, one of the most fundamental moments, one of the most historical moments in art is this one where Van Gogh cut off his ear. It sort of made him world famous. It made him stand apart from all other artists in the world. And so to challenge that, to say, well, maybe he didn't cut off his ear, or maybe only cut off a part of his ear, challenges how much this art is really worth and to what extent this art story is authentic. So make no mistake, a heck of a lot rides on this question. Did Van Gogh cut off his ear? Another kind of funny aspect to it is you could also say, well, how much of his ear did he cut off? If he cut off a little piece, does that mean he was suffering a little bit? If he cut off his whole ear, then that means he was suffering a lot, and then his art's worth so much more. And there's been some debate about that. There's been some debate about, did he cut off just a little piece of his earlobe? Did he cut off his whole ear? Or did he just sort of cut his ear but not sever it, and so he actually had no deformity whatsoever? In this episode, I'm going to touch fairly lightly on the information. If you Google Van Gogh ear, one of the first articles you're likely to come across is on Ripley's, and it's titled "The Truth About Van Gogh's Severed Ear." And this basically is a gives a story that some people think that Gauguin cut off his ear, but actually what happened is he cut off his own ear. What's quite interesting about Ripley's is it's believe it or not. So there definitely is that element to the story. There's another website that just discusses it, and it refers to the real story of Vincent van Gogh's severed ear. Now, bear in mind, you've already got this whole idea of what's the true story, what's the real story. And what that kind of suggests is that there is another story. Do you follow? In this article about the real story, I believe this particular website sells prints or sells copies of Vincent van Gogh artwork. So you can also imagine they would subscribe to the popular view. I certainly wouldn't want to challenge it. And yet it has been challenged. In 2009, there was a lot of coverage about this challenge. So just 11 years ago, there were many publications, including The Telegraph, The New York Times, The New Yorker, ABC News, and The Age, and all of them were referencing the same thing. All of them, oh, and The Guardian as well. All of them were referencing the same thing. They were talking about art historians, experts who were talking about why the evidence shows that Van Gogh didn't cut off his own ear, that Gauguin committed this act. And what is fascinating with this kind of analysis, especially from a true crime perspective, is how it is investigated almost like true crime. So what would you do? Well, they would go through his letters. They would go through the letters, and people may not realize this, but Vincent van Gogh wrote hundreds of letters in his life. Not one here and there, often one every single day or one every second day. And so you kind of have a timeline of what he was thinking and feeling, the people he was encountering, and then when an event happens, that's also documented in this stream of consciousness through his correspondence. Now you get something similar in modern true crime, where someone uses social media regularly, and then you also get to see how they feel about certain things, and pictures that they put up and all that kind of thing. And that's come up quite a lot recently. It's come up in the Oscar Pistorius case. It's come up with the Chris Watts case in a very big way. It's come up in the Heidi Broussard case to some extent as well. What makes the Van Gogh story so compelling is he didn't just write letters and very long detailed letters, but he also painted paintings. And so right after he cut off his ear, he made 2 self-portraits. And these self-portraits really stand apart from all the other portraits Van Gogh did of himself. In a lot of the portraits he did, you see kind of a lot of speckled energy lines. That's missing in these intense executions. Now, the German authors that came up with this theory in 2009 that Van Gogh didn't cut off his own ear and Gauguin did it, referred to the letters, just saying that there are a couple of hints left in the letters about a pact of silence, that both artists, for certain reasons, decided to keep what was going on a secret. And this isn't supposition. Van Gogh literally writes to Gauguin and he says, let's keep this between us. There are a couple of reasons why they would want to do it. I'm not going to go into that in a lot of detail here. I first want to kind of just introduce you to the concept and why it's quite a compelling narrative. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you through those self-portraits Vincent van Gogh wrote. I'm going to do it fairly briefly, and just to give you a little bit of reassurance. You might say, well, who are you to analyze art? I mean, aren't you a true crime writer? What do you know about art? And so what I can tell you is I do come from a family of artists. My brother is a professional artist, a full-time artist, in the same way that I'm a writer. My aunt is an artist. My great uncle is a famous artist, also a very popular artist in South Africa. And then my great grandfather is a master landscape artist in the Dutch tradition. So I do know probably more about art, I think, than the average person. I do a little bit of art myself, but I certainly have, I guess, a little bit of additional insight based on my family's connection to art and certainly my interest in art. And you don't need to be a rocket scientist to understand what I'm about to tell you. It's fairly simple, although it is somewhat intuitive. So the question we want to ask is, in those self-portraits that Vincent van Gogh painted of himself after injuring his ear, was he trying to say something? So bear in mind there's a pact of silence, but is he trying to communicate something through those paintings, right? If you look at the one painting, which is, let's just be quite blunt about it and just say it's very green. You see Van Gogh in a green coat. He's wrapped in a green coat. It's very explicitly green. And behind him is like a light green wall. And if you look very closely, if you look into his eyes, and you also look at the skin on his face, it's all kind of green, right? If you look at his irises, they're sort of green. If you look at some of the skin, including on his neck, it's green. So there's an abundance of green in this image. And you might say, well, so what? Green, what does green mean? I'm going to come back to that in a second, but I just want you to bear that thought in mind. The other thing just to be aware of is it's quite a well-executed portrait, wouldn't you say? So in other words, if you're saying that Van Gogh was so distressed and so lonely and so broken that he cut off his ear, well, he recovered pretty quickly to paint not just one but two self-portraits with a bandaged ear. He doesn't look haggard in these pictures. He kind of looks quite stern. He looks quite strong. He looks kind of, in my opinion, quite accusatory in quite a accusatory way at the viewer. Then if we juxtapose a self-portrait of Gauguin, you sort of see Gauguin also looking, it's almost the exact same kind of self-portrait as the one of Van Gogh in terms of the way his face and body are orientated towards the viewer, right? Behind him on his left, you kind of see a Christ-like figure. I think they call it the Yellow Christ. And there's also a certain amount of green in that image. Not a lot, certainly not as much as the Van Gogh, but there's a little bit around his collar and a little bit on the chest, I guess, of the Christ figure. But otherwise, it's a very brown and sort of red execution. Do you agree? It's sort of quite there's sort of orange and brown and red, and then also that sort of dark blue in the foreground. Also notice the sort of hooked nose to some extent of Gauguin, and again just that the way his mouth is and the way that his eyes are sort of looking at you. Now I want to take you to the second self-portrait, and in this one it's kind of a lot less busy, so there's less going on in the background. And what you see here is, again, he's wearing kind of a green jacket, so he's sort of cloaked in a sort of green jacket, and he's smoking a pipe. I don't think there's any other self-portrait where he's smoking anything. And then there's sort of two shades of orange and sort of either red or brown behind him, and the horizon to this sort of goes kind of the same height as sort of the ear level or eye level. So quite a few things may or may not be going on in this image. You're either seeing an intentional pointing of the finger towards the ear, but through this horizon line and to the eyes, or it's just coincidence. Then there's also the smoke coming out of the pipe, and you could say, well, that is smoke and mirrors or something like that. You might say, well, I think you're reading far too much into this portrait. Again, notice it's the same orientation of the face to the viewer as in the Gauguin self-portrait, and then also the Van Gogh self-portrait, the other one. It's the same sort of thing. In this one, his nose isn't so hooked. His eyes are less green, but there's still kind of an accusatory aspect in it. Here he does look a little more morose. He does look a bit more miserable. I'm not going to go into the date of these portraits. I mean, Portrait of a Yellow Christ is officially dated. It's not absolutely known. They say 1890, which was the year of Van Gogh's death, or 1891. He painted another painting, The Yellow Christ, which was 1889. I'm not going to go into that just yet. I want to just spend more time talking about colors. But in terms of the portrait, the self-portrait that sort of got these tones of burning orange and red, that may also refer to blood or even anger. That sort of hot-headedness and the heat of the moment that led to this. It might be a reference to that, or it might be a reference to something else. And if we go to the portrait that Vincent van Gogh painted of Gauguin, this was when Gauguin lived with him. It's kind of a snub portrait, if I can put it that way. In other words, the impression I get is that when Vincent van Gogh painted this, he wasn't trying to say nice things about Gauguin. So bear in mind, at this point, Vincent van Gogh still had his ear, and they were still living together, and he was painting Gauguin in the Yellow House, right? And just a couple of obvious points to make. Gauguin's got his back to him, and he's wearing kind of green, and he's got kind of a reddish brown beret on. But basically, Gauguin's the colors used to express Gauguin are basically just two colors: green, red, and brown. And then he's also got like a silver nose. That's something that just sticks out a little bit, is that although it's quite a weird picture, what sticks out is this sort of silver nose, and quite a prominent nose, almost like he's got this sort of snooty bearing about him. And also the fact that his chin is so pointy. It just seems like kind of both pointy and frilly, and or sort of curved at the same time. Opposite him on the one side is, I guess, a yellow wall of the Yellow House. And then there's also a slightly green wall, and that's the same tone that we see in the background of one of the Van Gogh portraits. I think the most important thing about this particular image is its size. It's a tiny portrait. It's almost as if Van Gogh, I don't know whether he didn't have access to a bigger canvas or what, but it's a very small little thing. It's almost as if he was trying to diminish Gauguin's stature by painting him within a small little canvas. And that brings us to the famous chair that Vincent van Gogh painted. Now, he painted another chair as well. I'm not going to show it here, but I'm sure you know which one I'm talking about. It's the straw chair with the pipes on it. And that was meant to depict Vincent van Gogh. That was a chair that showed his modesty. And I'll show it to you guys in another video. I don't want to contrast them right here. I don't want to talk about it right here so much. I just want to focus a bit more on Gauguin. So if you look at this chair, do you notice the sort of silvery grey reflections on the side of the wood? It's the same kind of silvery grey that you see reflected on his nose in that previous self-portrait. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, just go back to it. Then you see again the sort of red. It's such a rich red. It's almost it's such a rich brown. It's almost red, in the wood. And that again refers to his beret. It's the same sort of color. And then you've got this very rich contrast of the cushion that is a rich green with sort of lines of gold lint or something in between them. And I don't know whether this is a reference to Gauguin's interest in the tropics or his interest in the exotic, but it's nevertheless kind of emblematic of this colorful character that is Gauguin, with very expensive tastes and very particular tastes. If you look at the background, the wall in the background, you also see that rich, very verdant green in the background. And then the floor as well. Even the floor is this sort of tapestry of, it's like a scintillating sea of gold and red and green. And what Vincent van Gogh is trying to say through this image is how he sees Gauguin. He sees Gauguin as kind of ornate, kind of over the top, quite entitled, used to luxury, maybe even quite spoiled, but then also educated. That is why those books are on there, and the candles as well. Looks like one candle is alight and the other is out. The important thing just to note about this chair is how it contrasts to Vincent van Gogh, who's far more modest. I don't want to emphasize that right now. I want to just stick to these colors. So a painting that Gauguin did, and he often painted versions of Christ. You see a picture of Christ, I think in the Garden of Gethsemane or some garden, and some people have speculated that this red-haired Christ is actually Van Gogh, this sort of suffering person. Gauguin has been depicted as gauche, which means unsophisticated, socially awkward, shy, inelegant, graceless, and that his art was like that as well, but kind of in an innovative way. So unsophisticated art that was sort of primitive, but in a elegant way. It's not strange that you would have this depiction of somebody almost in a Christ-like way. You have Gauguin himself doing that with the self-portrait and the Yellow Christ. You kind of have Gauguin almost putting a halo around himself, having a picture of Christ, which is one of his own artworks, behind him, and another one, thereby creating a kind of a trinity, and almost like giving himself kind of a godlike aspect, which says something about the way that he saw himself. And what I'll be doing on this channel, probably not soon though, but at some point, I'll be reviewing the movie Gauguin, Voyage to Tahiti, and it's the voyage that he took after he left the Yellow House. He left Vincent van Gogh, and then he traveled to Tahiti, and he kind of had very young wives, and he was basically a paedophile. I mean, he had wives that were 13 years old, and he gave them syphilis. So I'm going to be taking you through that film, kind of as a fact checker and an analysis of who he really was, but taking the dramatizations and just sort of going through them, because we want to get to know who he was and how that reflects on Van Gogh, and also how it may have driven him crazy. Why could Van Gogh have been upset by what Gauguin was doing while they were staying together? What did they have in common? How did they see things differently? And I think the attitude to morals was very, very different. I think the one was, I'm not saying that either artist was a moral champion, but the one certainly was far less moral than the other. Gauguin, for example, abandoned his family to become an artist. He literally abandoned his wife and children. So that says a bit more. If you think about Van Gogh, he wanted his family to love him, and they sort of didn't. They sort of rejected him for his bad behavior. So it's a kind of a different story. Interestingly, after the ear incident, Gauguin went to Paris. A lot of people said he was so upset by what he saw. He was so upset by the blood and trauma. That's why he left. That doesn't make any sense, because he went straight from the train station to watch an execution. And he was so, and this is something he admits, it's something that he talks about in his biography. He was so caught up in it that he sort of pushed his way to the front, and there was like a really botched execution. The guillotine sort of slid, I guess, out of its channel to some extent, and it diced to some extent the face of the criminal. It was a botched execution, and so they had to raise the guillotine again, and then they succeeded in doing what had to be done. But you can kind of imagine Gauguin breathlessly looking at all of this, and if he had been traumatized by what happened to Van Gogh, why would he go to an execution? On the other hand, if he'd executed the cut to the ear, maybe he suddenly had this interest in blood and death and carnage, and this visceral sense of, almost from an artistic perspective, of suffering, but suffering made manifest. And amazingly, after seeing this execution, again, you might say, well, maybe he was just so traumatized he was trying to make sense of it. Well, he then went and he made a jug, and he in this jug that he made, he had blood coming, sort of pouring down the sides of the face of this jug. And the whole idea was that you would pour something through where it should be the top of the head of the jug, and then you drink out of it. It's almost like drinking the brains, or drinking the blood, or drinking the mind of another person. And there's something brilliantly crazy about that whole concept. So to draw these threads together, what I've showed you is how Van Gogh represents Gauguin, and he uses especially the colors green and brown, a kind of a tropical green and brown, and kind of a reddish, sort of rich red, to describe Gauguin in his portraits of him, not only his face but also the chair. We also see that Gauguin uses these same colors in his own sort of depictions of himself, and in a lot of his own artworks. So if you want to really simplify it, you could say that Vincent van Gogh's kind of trademark color is yellow, and then you could say Gauguin's trademark color is green and maybe also brown, but basically that's the difference between the two artists in terms of the palette. Now, when we come back to that self-portrait of Vincent van Gogh, what we see is a lot of green in the one. We see green in his eyes, we see green, he's wearing green as well. In the other portrait, we see a lot of brown in the other one. We see sort of brown and sort of a reddish sort of brown color. And you could make the case, I guess, that Vincent van Gogh is saying who did this to him. He's not literally saying it. He's not saying Gauguin cut off my ear, but the artwork is saying that, if that makes sense. And something that I interpret, and you can say I don't agree, and you can say, well, an art expert would disagree with you, whatever. It obviously is subjective. No one can be scientific about this, but you can see very clearly in Vincent van Gogh's eyes, in the one portrait, you see green in his eyes. And what is green emblematic of? Well, you can be green with envy. And Van Gogh was very envious of Gauguin. He's obsessed with him. This obsession isn't something I'm saying. It is something that's very well known in art history. And one can see how and why he was obsessed. Gauguin was more successful than what he was. Gauguin was more respected than what he was. Gauguin was selling paintings. Even Vincent's brother kind of held Gauguin in a higher standing in a way than his own brother. And so there was a lot to be jealous of, I guess. And Gauguin was also like, he stayed with Vincent van Gogh for a while, and then he was like, okay, I'm not enjoying this. This isn't fun. This is too much hard work. I want to go somewhere else and live a more fun-filled life, and I want to, there's just too many rules here, and it's too strict, and I don't want it all to be about art. I want to, indulge in my carnal desires a bit, and I want to, this isn't my idea of success. I want to be where the fun is. I want to have exhibitions and all that kind of thing. And you can kind of understand that, because just kind of a bum deal for Gauguin. He's sort of hanging out with this loser artist who smells and has bad habits and works really, really hard and just won't stop working, but isn't getting anywhere, and no one really respects him. And he wants to get out of that and sort of work on his respectability in terms of art. And you can see how Vincent van Gogh could be envious of that. And also, make no mistake, a lot of art always has been, and especially in terms of expressionism and so on, is symbolic. There's a lot of symbolism in it. A picture is not just a picture, it's saying something, it's communicating something. The colors are saying something. The nuances are saying something. And so what I'm trying to say is that through these two self-portraits, Vincent van Gogh's communicating his envy, but he's also making an accusation for who it was that cut off his ear. And so, just to kind of wrap up the point, nowhere in his letters does Vincent van Gogh utter the words, I cut off my ear. Nowhere. Nowhere does he raise his hand and say, guys, I cut off my ear. Nowhere. It's kind of assumed, and it's also kind of something that is just not spoken about explicitly. And you would ask that question, why is that? Why is that missing? Why does someone not simply say, why did you cut off your ear? Or why does that conversation not come up, especially with his brother? Conversely, and this is an excellent counter argument, you could say, why, if Gauguin cut off his ear, wouldn't he have told everyone? Why didn't he tell the police? Why wouldn't he be really angry with Gauguin and also never want to speak to him? Why did they remain friends? And again, you could say either he didn't cut off his ear and that's why they remained friends, or he did cut off his ear, but the reason was Van Gogh was this pest and this annoying, obsessive kind of super fan, right? Something else I'll address in episode later on, just to sketch the kind of world that they were living in. What was late 19th century France like to live in? The Eiffel Tower was being built. That was seen as this incredible innovation. It's almost like that was the innovation of its time, whereas today, one could say it's something like Facebook or whatever. And then also just the extent to which these guys, I'm talking about Vincent van Gogh and Paul Gauguin, were fascinated with true crime. True crime sort of started, one could argue, in this time. They were reading books about it. It was in the newspapers. Newspapers were also quite a new thing. So I'll talk to you guys about that as well. So there's also a kind of, that was something they would talk about if they were alone at home. They would talk about some of these signature high-profile criminal cases like Jack the Ripper. But I'll talk to you about that later on, about that whole concept. So we're 33 minutes into this video. It's already longer than I meant it to be. I'm not going to take it further than that. I really just wanted to show you that there is a counter narrative to the popular one, the mainstream one of Vincent van Gogh cutting off his own ear. It's not the scope of this video, and I'm certainly not going to do it a lot here, proving that case. I'm simply introducing you to the idea. I'm simply doing that. If you're interested in that, you're welcome to read The Murder of Vincent van Gogh. There I make the case. I refer to the letters. I refer to state of mind. I refer in detail to the various artworks and the identities of these people that we're talking about. But make no mistake, the ear incident was a criminal occurrence, whether it was self-harm or inflicted by someone else or as a result of an argument. But what that does, what that incident brought about was this question of, is Vincent van Gogh, does he have mental problems? Does he have severe mental problems? Was he mad, in effect? And that's going to be the next point of debate. Again, I'm not going to make the whole case. I'm not going to refer to all the evidence. I'm simply going to introduce you to the idea. If you want to go into it into further detail, by all means, do your own research. And again, you can read my book, The Murder of Vincent van Gogh. The book that I'm working on now, and it should come out June, July, The Final Journey of Vincent van Gogh, that will further emphasize the insights that are provided in the first book. So we're going to look even more clearly at issues of mental illness. We're going to look even more clearly at the dynamics between Van Gogh and Gauguin. We're going to get to know these people a lot better. And we're going to get to know another character, Dr. Paul Gachet. So if you're interested in that, please subscribe to this channel. You can head to Patreon for the analysis of the letters that I've started doing. So there's a letter that he wrote either on the 10th or 11th of February. So when it's a letter written 130 years ago today, I will be going through those letters on Patreon under the $3 tier. And I'm just going to be going through the letters and sort of leading you by the hand and just showing you what certain things mean, what paintings he painted when those letters were written. And that's how we're really going to get to know him in his own words, what he talks about. And he talks a lot about Gauguin. Even today, 10th February 2020, if you go back 130 years, he's talking about Gauguin. What is he saying? What is he planning? And it's actually really interesting. So if you're interested in that, head to the Patreon channel. It's Patreon/TCRS. And all of this is geared to setting up the final journey of Vincent van Gogh.
But there's something about Van Gogh's legacy which is much more important than his fathering this or that ism of modern art. Vincent's passionate belief was that people wouldn't just see his pictures, but feel the rush of life in them.